Welcome, everyone, to Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site. Thanks to everybody who made it out to Yonkers tonight and those of you who are joining us online. My name is Sarah Wasberg Johnson. I'm the Programs and Education Manager here. And we are very happy tonight to be hosting Keith Doherty. Keith received his doctorate in art history from Boston University, where he taught for 14 years. But since returning to his native Westchester, he has been writing extensively about the built history of the county and New York City, and has recently researched and written about free black farm owners in Lower Westchester in the early 19th century. He also leads tours of various areas of Manhattan. So tonight's talk is Takings, a History of Land Disputes Along the Line of the Aqueduct. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Friends of Old Croton Aqueduct and also the Maurice D. Hinchey Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area. And we are very pleased as Phillips Manor Hall to host Keith tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Doherty. I taught for a long time at BU and other places in Boston, as she mentioned, and I also grew up in Hastings-on-Hudson on the Old Croton Aqueduct. So I was one of those little kids that was, exploring it and climbing all over it and, having fun with it and not really knowing what it was, until I grew up and got a better sense of things. So I just want to thank everybody who made it happen, especially everybody at the Phillips Manor Hall, Sarah and John and Mike, and also everybody, Foka, Laura, Joanna Reisman, who's here tonight, Tom Tarnowski, et cetera. So, we're all aware of sort of the engineering marvel that was the Old Croton Aqueduct. This was a 41-mile conduit, a pipe that stretched from the northern limit of Westchester all the way to the heart of Manhattan. It was built in the 1830s. It delivered 75 million gallons of water a day to people in Manhattan. It was one of the engineering feats of its era in the world, without question. And most people who talk about it and who discuss its history tend to celebrate that fact, justifiably. And I don't want to diminish any of that. However, there is sort of an untold story of the aqueduct, and that is the various profound ways that it impacted the lives and livelihoods of farmers and mill owners and others whose operations were more or less decimated by the loss of arable land, structures, blocking of roadways and waterways when they were forced to sell their property to the developers of the aqueduct. It was an early exercise in eminent domain, which I'm sure you know, is a process whereby a government entity, in this case the state, can legally seize land for a public purpose. Landowners were paid for their land, it's true, but the bottom line is they had no choice in the matter, and most of them entered into the transactions unwillingly. So most of the people whose lands were confiscated were the sons and grandsons of the original tenant farmers of Westchester. That is, the people who basically broke the land and developed it in the first place. Names like Purdy and Cortland, Van Wart and Tarrytown, Wilsey and Dobbs, Post and Yonkers, et cetera. It's like reading the rent rolls of Frederick Phillips, before the Revolution. Okay, so these people were not interested in selling their land. They were not interested in helping out New York City. And so, yes, and many of them remembered things like the War of 1812 and even the Revolution. So this is not exclusively, however, a story of suffering on the part of landowners. Indeed, as the project progressed, we find an increasing converse impact on the architecture and even the route of the aqueduct by the landowners themselves, who were able, through protests and litigation, to mitigate the effects of the project on their land and leverage it in ways to their personal advantage. So it's sort of a two-sided story, and I'm just going to go ahead, and I don't want to assume anything. Okay, I gave this talk initially for my sister over there, and I was really deep in the weeds, and she was like, "Hang on, man." She's like, "What's an aqueduct?" No, She knew what an aqueduct was, but she was like, can we get a little context? And so if you're not necessarily aware, yes, the OCA, what we call the Old Croton Aqueduct, 41-mile conduit, as I said, it runs from, I've got my laser pointer, it runs from Cortland, not Croton, but actually Cortland. It's called Croton Aqueduct because it comes from the Croton River, all the way down to Manhattan. Here are some people walking on it today. Not really sure what they're not really sure what this thing is, but if they're here tonight, they're gonna learn. So yes, so at the source in Cortland, a dam was built, and it is currently underwater, unfortunately, because confusingly, the old Croton Aqueduct became the new Croton Aqueduct about 50 years after it was built, and so the old dam is submerged today, but this is what it looked like, trust me, okay, at the source, and it created a reservoir that looked something like that on the bottom, and basically this is just the swollen Croton River, which was backed up because of the dam so that they could use it, so that they could channel it into the pipe. Okay, this is what the dam looks like now, because again, confusingly, the new Croton Aqueduct was built on top of the old Croton Aqueduct. I don't want to throw you too many curveballs, but basically, that's what's going on, okay? So this one was built downriver of the old one, and so it swelled the river even bigger, and it looks like that. It's actually quite tranquil. You would never know that there are many, many farms and mills underneath the water, but we'll talk about those in a second. The aqueduct was meant to feed Manhattan. I mean, if you know anything about the history of the aqueduct, you know that in the 1830s, Manhattan was literally dying. Okay, they had just had, in 1837, when the project was begun, they had just had a horrible cholera epidemic that had wiped out like a quarter of the city. They had had a fire that was so tremendous that literally a quarter of the city was burned down, the fire of 1835. They were relying on well water, most of which was heavily contaminated. They needed this water desperately, okay? And so the delivery of water to Manhattan was this, this transformative process for people in Manhattan. And there were lots of, the original structures, the original reservoirs in Manhattan were really impressive. There were two of them. One was in Central Park. It was where the Great Lawn is now, right about 86th Street, and that was the receiving reservoir, and that received millions and millions of gallons, and it could hold it in storage in case people needed it later. And then there was a second reservoir down where the New York Public Library is and Bryant Park are, called the distributing reservoir. And from there, the water would go to individual houses, go to individual neighborhoods, and so on. Okay? So there's nothing left of this thing, even though it was absolutely amazing. It was done in this kind of neoclassical, or specifically like a neo-Egyptian style. It was meant to look like an Egyptian temple, and it was very impressive indeed. And the builders invited Manhattanites to, stroll around the top of it on the parapet and, make a day of it. Because of course, 42nd Street at the time in the 1830s was the countryside. Okay. And when we walk on the aqueduct today, few of us may be aware that under our feet is an enormous pipe, about 7 feet high, about 5 feet wide, okay? Looks a little bit like this. And here are some people on the aqueduct, probably not aware that there's a pipe under their feet. This is what it looks like inside. It's actually very impressive. It changes depending on what kind of terrain it's going through. So this is what it looks like for most of its course. It has a brick vault, but if they happen to be going through a hillside, which you've got right here, it's got a rock cut vault. They were using dynamite. Lots of guys died. Yeah. And so, I mean, there are different adaptations, there are different arrangements. Sometimes the aqueduct is completely underground and you have no idea that you're walking on top of a pipe. It just looks like a nice path, which is really all it is for most people these days, and that's great. So Lyndhurst there is completely flat, also in Ossining, but most of the time it sort of surfaces a little bit or a lot. Okay, so over here, this is in Tarrytown, this is in the Bronx. You can see just how high above ground it is. It's most visible when it is crossing over tributaries or streams, okay? Like all along, I mean, basically the aqueduct parallels the Hudson River, so all along its path there are these tributaries, small streams that are feeding the Hudson River, and the aqueduct has to leap over them, okay? And so you get these bridges. Sometimes they're really fancy and really nice, like this one in Ossining, but most of the time they look like this. They're just culverts, which are much less expensive, and so the city loved that. But they have their own beauty, I think. And this is just very briefly, okay? And I'm sorry for the hand-drawn map, okay? I could not find a cross-section of the Hudson Valley anywhere, but basically the engineers of the aqueduct had to build the aqueduct along what is more like a sheer wall, basically. It's the east side of the Hudson Valley, okay? It's flat in some parts. There are like little terraces and stuff with farmhouses and things. But it also has lots of very steep ridges, and so they had to adapt to whatever kind of terrain that was going on. Okay, and when it was flat, usually they were knocking down farmhouses, or they were taking arable land. When it was slanted, or on an incline, they were usually blocking roads, the kind of roads that farmers needed because they had to deliver their crops from the farms down to the Hudson River, to docks on the Hudson River. So the aqueduct really disrupted the physical and economic fabric of the Hudson Valley pretty seriously. Any questions? The turnout is pretty good tonight. I didn't know. Yeah.
So how long did it take them to build the aqueduct?
5 years. Yeah, 5 years. It's not bad at all. I mean, it's amazing. You know, at any one time, at the height of building, they had up to 3,000 people, Irishmen, basically, working along different parts of it. And they got it done in 5 years. It was 1830. You know, they didn't have steam shovels, they didn't have automobiles, they didn't have any of that, and they got it all done. It's really an amazing thing. The potato famine was 1845. So this was actually well before the potato famine, but the Irish had begun to immigrate here in large numbers, like mid 1830s. Oh, sorry. Just very briefly, the cast of characters. Can you hear me if I'm not at the microphone? Yeah. Okay, so. Oh, really? So there are like another 30 people inside this camera, so I have to talk to them as well. So there are a couple of there are a couple of key figures, people who are very, very important to this process that I should mention. The first is this fellow Stephen Allen, who was really sort of the bulldog. He was the primary kind of engine, the power broker, you know, that pushed the aqueduct through. He was a self-made man. He was scrappy. He was cantankerous. At different points in time, he was the mayor of New York City. He was a state assemblyman, a state senator, and he was eventually appointed the chair of the Water Commission, the body that actually executed the aqueduct, and he hated landowners in Westchester. You know, he called them a nuisance. He called them an embarrassment. You know, he really didn't like them at all, okay, because they were holding up his project. This fellow over here is David Bates Douglas. He was the initial chief engineer for the aqueduct. He was appointed in 1833. These two could not be more different. Douglas was born rich. He was educated at Yale. He was a professor for most of his, before he was assigned to the aqueduct, and didn't have a heck of a lot of hands-on practical experience. And so the knock on him is that he was too much of a theoretician. He was too much of an intellectual. He had all these experimental, like untried ideas that he wanted to use. The big thing about him, though, that got him fired ultimately in 1836 is that it took him forever to produce a survey. In order to get going, they needed maps. You know, they needed a survey of the land, and he did 4 separate surveys over the course of 3 years. This drove Allen absolutely nuts. The reason Douglas was doing that is because he was actually responding to the concerns of landowners. He was trying to get around farmhouses. He was trying to get around features that were necessary for the economic well-being of Westchester. Allen did not like this, fires Douglas, okay, and brings on this fellow here, Jervis. Jervis is sort of John Jervis. This guy is usually given the credit for building the aqueduct. In fact, he mostly used plans and things that Douglas had developed. However, he was really the man for the moment, I have to admit. I mean, he was firm with the landowners, but he made concessions to them, you know, and he was able, in addition to being a pretty brilliant engineer, I mean, this guy, you know, had been instrumental in the Erie Canal, he had been instrumental in the Chenango Canal, several of the, you know, biggest railroads in America and so on. So he had all the engineering expertise, but he was also enough of a diplomat, enough of a politician to reconcile landowners and Stephen Allen, reconcile the city and landowners, which was quite a feat, I have to say. And so he really is sort of, he deserves a lot of the credit that he gets for pushing things forward. So I'm going to proceed geographically. I'm not going to proceed chronologically because so many different things are happening on the aqueduct at the same time in different spots. So it's if I went chronologically, we'd be jumping all over the place. So I'm just going to kind of give you the story of a few areas. And I want to start at the source, which is Cortlandt Manor. Okay, it was Cortlandt Manor, you know, was something that had existed since before the Revolution. You know, if you've ever, Stephanus Van Cortlandt and all, this family is like one of the biggest landowners in New York State, and they still had a tremendous amount of land, and it was their land that held the source, that held most of the Croton River. And so they you know, the commissioners had to approach them first, buy their land. They did, and they eventually created a dam and a reservoir in Cortlandt Manor, or as we call it today, Cortlandt. The reservoir, I'm going to keep myself in one spot and just nail my feet into place. All right, so the reservoir looked like this here. It was created by putting a dam sort of midway along the river and causing the Croton River to swell quite a bit. So this is a map that was made in 1835 that shows the projected flood line, or shows the projected extent of the reservoir as they thought it would be. And you can see in the center, here's the Croton River sort of as it was in 1835, and this is the extent that they thought it would go to when it flooded because of the dam. And you can very clearly see, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, quite a number of farmhouses. There were also, by my count, at least 12 operational mills, all of which were immersed, you know, were erased. They were completely submerged, not to mention about 4 miles worth of Broadway and 1, 2, 3 bridges. So this was something that destroyed a community. This you know, that's not hyperbole. It did that. 12 farms, 12 mills, et cetera, et cetera. Just one story that kind of strikes me and I think is particularly poignant. The Quaker Meeting House, the Croton Valley Meeting House. It was a Quaker meeting house, and it existed on the Croton River, and it was deluged, you know, it was inundated, immersed, whatever word you want to use, when they created the reservoir. It was not just a meeting house, it was also a carriage house, a school, and a cemetery. So all of this went underwater. They dismantled the meeting house and actually rebuilt it when the reservoir was complete at the new sort of flood line. And then they built the new Croton Aqueduct, and the Quakers had to move again. So they moved further upland. Actually, and this is the third incarnation of the Quaker meeting house. And I think actually the second one, they literally dismantled the first and reassembled it. This only has a few original components, like the threshold here in front of the door. But this is the sort of thing that went on. I don't know what happened to this school. I don't know what happened to this cemetery where the dead disinterred and reinterred or what. I don't know. Mills on the Croton, like I said, there were quite a few of these. This is a map from 1835, and it depicts a number of mills. Okay, and these were all over the place on the Croton River, and especially on the tributaries of the Croton River. We don't think of Westchester County as being like an industrialized place, particularly. In the early 19th century, we think of it as, at least I always thought of it as farms, but actually there was quite a bit of industry, and especially on the Croton River. They had all kinds of mills. They had grist mills, they had sawmills, they had wire mills. They were making all kinds of stuff, and all of these mills were destroyed. They were compensated. I don't want to give the impression that the mill owners, the farmers were not compensated. They were compensated, but actually they were not compensated very well, and they weren't compensated sort of in perpetuity. They lost the income they were going to have in the present, as well as everything they were going to make into the future. Many of them rebuilt, but many of them did not. So this is an awesome map. I'm sorry I'm showing so many maps, but man, could they make maps back then? I mean, these are really nice, And I'm like a map guy, so this is an awesome map of a mill belonging to the Tompkins family on one of the tributaries of the Croton, and you can see the mill pond here, the dam, the mill itself, and sort of some outbuildings. This pink represents the water line that's going to exist when they flood the river. And so this is just another instance of a business lost as a result. So Douglas, remember we talked about Douglas versus Jervis, right? Douglas being the one who was much more receptive to the needs of landowners. Douglas did not want to build the dam where it eventually got built. He wanted it much further upriver. Okay, this is where it eventually got built by Jervis. This is where Douglas wanted it, and he wanted it there because the area was much less developed. He also created a system, and I am not an engineer. I have no idea if this would have worked at all, but he called it a confluent reservoir, and it was going to be a relatively small reservoir that was fed by a series of smaller satellite reservoirs that were located sometimes 2 and 3 miles away, okay? And they were going to be connected by a web of iron pipes that was going to feed the confluent reservoir. This would have been obviously much less destructive. Not only did he want to build it further away from development, but the reservoir itself was going to be much smaller because most of the water was going to be stored in these like satellite reservoirs. The idea was rejected more or less out of hand, okay, by Stephen Allen because way too expensive, way too expensive. Not only because it was further upriver, not only would he have to build 5 extra miles of aqueduct, but he would have to build this spider web of iron pipes, some of which were like 3 miles long. Allen was not having it, and so we got the dam where it is. Jervis, and we have the 12 farms lost, we have the 14 mills lost, et cetera, et cetera. They basically did the math, and they figured out it was easier to drown a bunch of farms than build the reservoir where Douglas wanted it. So, so Jervis builds the dam where it is, and there's a problem with this. And again, I don't want to get like too technical about this. I'm not an engineer. I don't completely understand what I'm talking about either. However, from what I understand, okay, when Jervis built his dam and his reservoir, he did it at a point where there was actually an outcropping, like a rock outcropping that came into the river, and he decided he was going to make use of this outcropping and turn it into part of his dam and save even more money, okay? The problem with this little spot on the river is that there was very little bedrock in the river bed. That's significant because when you build a dam, you have to have a spillway, okay? This thing here, right, which is going to release the excess water if it gets too high in the reservoir. A spillway must be built on bedrock. You can't build it on like gravel or silt because the action of the constantly falling water is going to erode the riverbed and cause the whole thing to become unstable. There was not enough bedrock. Jervis built it anyway, and so his spillway was too narrow. He knew it, and he did it anyway. Okay? And then Cortland experienced the worst flood that it had seen in about 40 years, what they called the Great Freshet of 1841. Jervis called it a very unlooked for flood. And indeed, it was unlooked for by him. The locals knew that this sort of thing could happen. They were well aware of that. And so the flood came down, the waters came down and burst through his dam in short order. And it created this explosive acceleration of the flood that destroyed virtually everything downriver. And it coughed up so much mud and dirt that the mouth of the Croton River became unnavigable by any sort of ship or anything like that. It's immensely destructive. At least 3 people were killed. I suspect the number's a lot higher. But the water came on so quickly, so dramatically that, like 15 or 20 families had no warning, and they were climbing trees to get away from the water. A lot of them survived. A lot of them didn't. The trees were ripped up. They were sent down to their deaths. And so, Jervis acknowledged the mistake. He wrote actually a whole essay about the mistake and whatever, but he makes a lot of excuses in that essay. He really does, and what he says most of the time is just that, well, I've been here for 4 years. I've never seen the river do that, He says it like 3 times. Anybody knows, you've got to spend more than 4 years on a river to really understand what it can do. And if he had consulted the locals, he would have had a much better idea of what the Croton can do. There's a story, actually, it's probably apocryphal, but there's a story that a local farmer approached one of the engineers, or rather one of the foremen, and said, that dam is never going to hold. The Croton is going to rise one day, and it's going to, destroy that dam. That spillway is too narrow, et cetera, et cetera. And the foreman said, man, I could dam the Croton with my hat, And he said, well, you have not seen the Croton angry. And he hadn't. And it got very angry in 1841, and the results were disastrous. Eventually, they rebuilt it. Jervis kind of invented his way out of it. He created a spillway that had like an S-curve, so it didn't need bedrock, et cetera. But the damage was done. So there was a lot of resistance early on, as you might expect, especially in the area of Cortland. Initially, this is what happened. I don't follow my script, and I have to find the spot. Okay. So initially, it took the form of vandalism. It was very disorganized. People were throwing dead animals into the reservoir and other offensive matter. Residents in the area, stakes were getting pulled up, and my personal favorite, the heads of dead horses were being cut off and put on pikes and then stuck in the middle of the work area in the middle of the night. Godfather style, It's pretty ominous. I don't know, maybe it's an 1830s thing. I don't know, okay? Eventually, however, the resistance got a lot more concerted. It got a lot more organized, and we have the single most virulent, the most, the most, staunch enemy of the aqueduct was a guy called Theodorus Cortland Van Wyck. And Theodorus, or Theo, let's just call him that. Theo was the son-in-law of Pierre Van Cortland, who was sort of the unofficial lord of Cortland Manor. He was. Pierre Van Cortland, so he basically decided that he was going to fight the aqueduct because nobody had to give up more land than the Van Cortlands. They gave up something like 27 acres, and they didn't get much for it, actually. And so he wrote a memorial, which is basically a petition to the legislature the state legislature at the time, where you ask, it's a petition for new legislation. And what he wanted was the law that made the OCA possible to be repealed. And, this is a short quote. In the opinion of your memorial, it's him, this act is incompatible with, repugnant, and subversive of the Constitution, the state constitution. Its intent is to substitute the will of the said city, New York City, for the will of the owners of the property. He was basically arguing against eminent domain, and I read through the whole argument, and man, it's really obtuse, just to say the least. It did not convince the legislature. It failed, obviously, and it was also too ambitious. I think he wanted to repeal the entire, he wasn't looking to modify it, or he wanted to eradicate it just personally himself. The city was too powerful. It was not going to happen. What did get passed, though, was an amendment. A coalition of landowners met in Tarrytown, and they decided they were going to push through an amendment that said the city sure can build their aqueduct, but they've got to do certain things, like they've got to build fences, which are going to mark off their property from the surrounding property, and they've got to build passes. They've got to build roads, ramps, tunnels that are going to preserve pre-existing arteries. So, okay, moving south. Ossining is like, if you're, sorry. So Ossining is like the most fun place. Like if you're an OCA like geek, you got to go to Ossining. It's like the treasure. It's like the Holy Grail, right? More people were living in Ossining, and this was a discovery. More people were living in Ossining, or Sing Sing as it was called at the time, than anywhere else in the county in the 1830s. The population of Ossining was over twice that of Yonkers. And even White Plains. I'm still not sure why that is, but I know this is a great painting that I found. Basically, I know that it was very heavily industrialized along what's called the Sing Sing Kill, which is the main waterway feeding the Hudson, runs through the middle of Ossining. And when they came into Ossining, they had to buy land from something like 25 different parties. It was really densely populated. And so actually one of the things that Theo Van Wyck argued is that, New York City, if New York City is out of water, then you should just, and we have plenty of water, you should just turn us into a city up here in Cortland. Why are you bothering down there in Manhattan? We have all the water, why don't you just come up here and build a city here? That was part of his argument, and when I first read that, I was like, how ridiculous. But places like Ossining were for the 1830s, pretty thickly populated. It wasn't as absurd an argument as it may seem. And so to get over the Sing Sing Kill, the engineers had to do quite a few tricks, and they built one of the most impressive bridges along the entire stretch. It carried the conduit directly across the kill, and it was hundreds of feet high because they needed to. This was pretty well north, so that the aqueduct was still pretty high up. Incidentally, the aqueduct is just a gravity-fed mechanism, okay? I mean, the whole thing just operates because there's a very, very slight incline in the aqueduct, and so the water is flowing because it's at an incline of like 1 degree or something. And so they've got to maintain this incline across the entire 41 miles. At Ossining, that incline was still pretty high, and so they built this bridge, which even today is very scary to be on top of. It's so big that there are actually multiple bridges built beneath it, or it's so high, rather. And so the bridge is really impressive. You should go and look at it, and it's much more impressive than most of the river crossings, which look like this, the homely culvert. There's about 100 of these. Very rarely did the city spring for a bridge like this. So, with one exception that we'll see. Also in Ossining, we have a really nice example of a tunnel that was built by the city to facilitate traffic. And in this case, we have a deluxe, right? It's two-way traffic, okay? Horse and carriage. You can have two of them passing. This was Broadway at the time. Here's a map, okay, and you can see Broadway is intersecting with the aqueduct, and so they build this tunnel to allow traffic to continue to move. It was part of the amendment. They were bound, legally bound, to create this kind of thing. This one is especially beautiful. If you're an engineer, or a builder or an architect, you can appreciate this quite a bit. I mean, when they could, they like to build like barrel vaults, just semicircular barrel vaults. And this one is an ellipse. It's elliptical, which is much more difficult to do. It's because they didn't have the vertical clearance to build a nice barrel vault. So there you go. I enjoy that. I don't know, not most people. Okay, and here's a little sketch, showing lovely peasants, walking along through the arch, and so on. There was a guy called John Singh in Sing Sing. Apparently, his last name is coincidental with the name of the town. I doubt that. I don't know if that's really the case, but John Singh was sort of the most powerful guy in town. He owned the most land, and he knew that the aqueduct had to come through his land because he was at the highest point. He was at the only point along the Sing Sing Kill where you had two high promontories on either side that would support the conduit in the way that they needed. And so he ran a very, very hard bargain. He ended up becoming the best paid person along the entire route. He got something like $4,000 an acre, which, I don't know what that is today, a lot, okay? The farmers in Cortland, by contrast, whose farms were submerged, got like $100 an acre. So Singh really used the aqueduct to his advantage. He became pretty wealthy. He also had a sawmill, okay, on the north side of the aqueduct, or rather, excuse me, the east side of the aqueduct, and his house was on the west side of the aqueduct. And he said, I don't want to have to walk through that Broadway tunnel to get to my place of work, to get to my sawmill. And so they built this for him. It's a pedestrian tunnel through the aqueduct. It's the only example of it along the line. But this is it's the sort of thing, I mean, I just can't believe he got them to do this. It's the funniest thing ever. You can't go through it, though, unfortunately. Unfortunately. There's always scaffolding or something around it. Another couple of cool features that I noticed, in my ramblings. I live in Hastings, so I'm keeping a much closer eye on the aqueduct in Hastings than elsewhere. And I noticed this one day. It's an earthen ramp. It runs basically from the top of the aqueduct, which if you can't tell is right here, comes straight down to the base of the aqueduct here, and it is exactly as wide as, an ox and a cart would be. It's a permanent feature. It's obviously meant to be used sort of in perpetuity, and I believe that it was built as a cheap version of a tunnel to preserve a farm road that had been interrupted by the aqueduct. And there is, in fact, a farm road that goes straight down to a dock on the Hudson. Here, if you look at the old maps, it's right here, okay? And this lines up with it directly. I assume, and I don't know this because it's never been documented, but there are about 3 or 4 of these that I found on the aqueduct, and they all line up with farm roads. So I assume this is a way of preserving, an artery, a way down to the river. Here's another one in Tarrytown, or Sleepy Hollow, sorry. And it also lines up with the farm road. And so I am assuming, and no one has told me I'm wrong yet, so I'm pretty sure that's what we're looking at here. Yonkers. All right, we finally made it. We're in Yonkers. Yonkers, oh, I'm right on time. Okay. So Yonkers, there's a lot of interesting features in Yonkers. One of my favorite things that happened in Yonkers is that they actually had a plan to put the Sawmill River into the aqueduct. They were going to annex the Sawmill River because they wanted more volume, and that was something that was a plan that they had early on, and they nixed it because they wanted to save the valuable mills at the mouth of the sawmill, which would have been right outside here. The mills that went right back to the Phillipses and even Adrian Vanderdonk before him. You're looking at a map of them here. And the engineers, a guy called Martineau, who was an associate of Douglas, says, we could put the water into the aqueduct, but this is deemed objectionable principally because we'd prematurely divert the water from the valuable mills near the village of Yonkers, which would involve heavier damages, blah, blah, blah. However, this is not a problem because the supply will be sufficient for at least a century to come. He was wrong about that, but that's how he's comforting himself, and that's how he's justifying the decision to spare the mills in Yonkers. So this is a completely different attitude from what we saw at the source. And we see this as the project goes on, landowners gaining agency. Another cool thing in Yonkers is a clear diversion of the route in response to a protest on the part of a landowner. Mr. Shonard, Edward Shonard, there's Shonard Terrace over here, there's Shonard Place, thank you. These are all named after a very recalcitrant sort of cantankerous farmer who was not happy about the aqueduct at all. And he wrote many letters to John Jervis about this and about that. One thing he was very concerned about were his fields. He had a very large field. He was planting all kinds of stuff in the area that is now the Hudson River Museum and Trevor Park. So this was actually where he was doing most of his farming, and the aqueduct, because it was jutting out from the hillside, was going to block all the water that was coming down. It was being irrigated. His fields were being irrigated by lots of small streams, and they were all going to be blocked by the aqueduct. And so a diversion was made for Mr. Shonard, and you can see it in maps. This is the original map made by Douglas at the beginning, and this is a slightly later map, about 20 years later. You can see that it's been turned a few degrees. Among other things, you see this little structure here, which would have been destroyed in the former plan, but it's mostly, like I say, about saving his fields and his irrigation system. So this is a letter from Jervis. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it survives. It's up in the Jervis Library in Rome, New York, which is where most of the original documents are. And Jervis is basically writing to the Water Commission. And he's saying, here's what we want to do. We want to bring the line up at 2 points. And the higher ground is going to admit land drainage to pass over the aqueduct. Shonard wants the water to continue to flow down, and he wants it to go over the aqueduct, not be blocked by it. And so we're going to bring the line up. Messrs. Shonard and Simpson, who was the neighboring landowner, made much objection to the work being elevated over the ground. And they will, it is presumed, be much opposed to culvert ditches wherever they may be informed. And so we're going to lengthen the line, and this is adopted, 12 feet, we'll have 2 more curves, blah, blah, blah. It's interesting because it's proof that Jervis is actually manipulating the route in response to landowner concerns. And there are lots of little diversions like this. I don't know how many they are or how significant they are, but it opened my eyes to just how much of the route of the aqueduct may have been determined by infrastructure that is no longer here. So okay, so this is me walking on the aqueduct, right? And I'm walking south, and here's Shonard Terrace right here, and there is a clear turn left. And it corresponds to this in the map, I believe. And a left turn will bring the aqueduct up by definition because it's in a hillside. So if you turn left, you're turning into the hill. It's something that they didn't like to do because it involved excavation. Yeah, so here's Shonard Terrace. And walking on the aqueduct in Shonard's land is a very different experience from walking on the aqueduct elsewhere. Most of the time when you're walking on the aqueduct, it looks like this. Okay, it's built on a huge embankment that juts out of the hillside like that. In Shonard's area, it runs more like this. Again, I don't have proof, but I assume this is evidence of what Jervis is talking about in his letter. And there are other stretches like that in Tarrytown and elsewhere, and it may have been for the same reason. Here's another really, really cool diversion. This map is very rare. We have a lot of really cool maps in the Westchester County Archives and a couple of other places, especially the DEP in New York City has a lot of really cool maps. But this one is special. It's from the county archives because it actually shows a diversion together with the former route. So it shows the route as built here, but it also shows the route as planned here. So, and you can see the difference is very clear, and obviously, you're saving this little schoolhouse here. I assume that's what motivated the change. So, which is extraordinary. I mean, and this is the land now, okay? It's Ashburton and Broadway. It's right up the hill, right over here. And it's empty, okay? That schoolhouse is no longer there. But guess what? The OCA is still avoiding it to this day, okay? And this is a great illustration of kind of what I'm talking about, which is, the aqueduct in many ways is sort of like, a liquid Jello when you pour it into a mold, and then you let it solidify. You take the mold away, and the imprint of that mold is still there. The mold is gone, but its imprint is still there. So the negative imprint of infrastructure is what really determines much of what the aqueduct is. Okay. So, and by the way, I just want to point out that by making this particular diversion, they actually made a sharp turn even sharper by like 2 degrees or something. So this is already a pretty sharp turn. The aqueduct is running like this, and then it turns like that, up Ashburton toward Tibbetts. And so by making this diversion, they are making a sharp turn still sharper, which they did not like to do. I mean, they avoided this at all costs. So the fact that they're doing this for a schoolhouse is remarkable. Yes, sir?
Why did they detest sharp curves?
They're dangerous. If you have a really, really heavy volume of water, there are waves that can occur inside the aqueduct. And so you can get, at different points, much more pressure than at other points. And a curve is dangerous. You could have a buildup. Yeah. So they avoided this at all costs. Okay. Stone fences. There's a ton of these, especially in Tibbetts and especially in Van Cortlandt Park. They run for miles. And they very clearly align, and I'm showing you 2 pictures of one of them in Tibbetts, and they're not very high, but they were probably about, waist high originally, and there's tons of them, like I said, in Tibbetts and Van Cortlandt. They correspond to the limit of the city's property. So when the city bought acreage from you, they always bought a 66-foot wide right of way. And the aqueduct represents the central kind of axis, and then you have this buffer zone on either side. And people are always fighting about this buffer zone. Who does it belong to? Is it the cities? Is it mine? Landowners along the aqueduct tend to think that it belongs to them, even to this day. Okay, it doesn't. It belongs to the city. And what these stone fences demarcate is the limit of the right of way. I don't know why these are there. I think it's very curious, but I do know that when the aqueduct was being built, you had thousands, and I mean thousands, of Irish immigrants pouring into Westchester. Most of these people, most of these guys, because they were mostly young men, were desperately poor. Most of them were on the edge of starvation. They had come from an Ireland that was completely falling apart. The famine was really just the coup de grace for Ireland in the early 19th century. So you had, by 1835, you had something like 300,000 Irishmen in New York City. So they were an enormous source of cheap labor. They would do anything. They were desperate. And so these guys were coming up by the thousands into Westchester, and the farmers were terrified. I mean really, really terrified. And they were terrifying. There's no doubt. I'm Irish. I think they were probably very terrifying, And we have to remember that Westchester was a really homogeneous place, racially speaking. By the time you get to 1830, you hadn't had a substantial new group of people in Westchester for like 100 years. It's basically Dutch and or formerly enslaved black, and some French, some German, and English. But to have this, large work crews of new people coming in was very disturbing. This is a good kind of illustration. It's a letter from a guy called Jacob Purdy, who was a landowner in Cortland, and I'll just read it quickly. Basically, he's writing to the commission, and he's saying, I can't make a real estimate of the inconvenience, trouble, and anxiety of having between 300 and 500 Irishmen on my farm within a few rods of my dwelling house. No estimate could be found, no calculation could be found to make this up to me. I can assure you it is no pleasant thing to have 14 huts or shanties, as they are called, stuck up within a few rods of my dwelling, and people with the lowest and most filthy of mankind, children, nearly naked before your eyes and that of your family. And so this is typical of the sentiment that you see on the part of landowners toward the Irish gangs that were coming up. This is a typical illustration. This is actually from 1871, so this is like 50 years after the aqueduct. It's by Thomas Nast, who is really the most celebrated caricaturist in New York City in the 19th century. And he's depicting an Irishman sitting on a barrel of gunpowder with a lit torch, and the torch is descending toward the gunpowder. He's got his bottle of whiskey in his hand, and he's depicted as a sort of a subhuman monster. This is really typical. Actually, he's depicted as an ape, as a monkey, and this is how Irish tended to be depicted. Dangerous, subhuman. It was that they were that despised. And here is a little shanty town. This is like 1890s or something, but it's on Amsterdam Avenue, or what was Amsterdam Avenue, 10th Avenue. Or rather, what is Amsterdam? 10th, 9th? Something. So at the top of Amsterdam, when the grid was still being built, okay, it gives you a sense of the squalor that the Irish were living in at the time. And so I suspect that these stone fences are an attempt on the part of farmers to strictly demarcate the line between what the city owns and what they own, so that the laborers stayed on the right side of the wall. That's what I suspect. Okay, so to conclude, okay, the greatest victory by far, I think, of any landowners along the aqueduct was the Highbridge. If you haven't been to the Highbridge, you got to go. Ossining is pretty cool, but this is real, the piece de resistance as far as, it's the most beautiful, really the most impressive structure along the entire aqueduct. And of course, it goes over the Harlem River, so it represents the connection between the Bronx, which you see in the distance here in the picture, and Manhattan here, which is the ultimate goal, right? Get to the island of Manhattan, okay? And the Highbridge, very, very impressive. The city did not want to build this thing. It was really expensive. It ended up costing $1 million, which in 1830, it wasn't completed until 1848. $1 million at the time was, absolutely ridiculous. I should mention also that the city, from 1838, really right through 1845 or something, was experiencing one of the worst depressions that the city had ever experienced. Stock market crash, the worst in the city's history. It had occurred in 1837, so it was an extra layer of pressure here on Stephen Allen and his ilk to get things done cheaply, inexpensively. And so this Highbridge was a huge debate. In addition to its beauty and the grandeur, it also had the advantage, incidentally, of allowing for plenty of boat traffic to go through it, which is something that was a concern for the landowners. They wanted plenty of boats to be able to go back and forth because they thought it would encourage commerce, the development of the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. So the Highbridge had all those advantages, but its chief advantage, as far as the people of New York were concerned, was that it was awesome. It was awesome. It was spectacular. Okay, people in New York had been suffering. The joblessness was through the roof. There had been very little development. Nothing had gotten built really in like 6 years. They knew it was expensive. They didn't care. And so the people of New York specifically were very much behind this monument because for them, it was a monument to their greatness. New York City wanted to be recognized as one of the great cities of history. They wanted something that proved that they were standing head and shoulders with the ancient Romans themselves. Okay, so these are all the advantages of the Highbridge, and a big reason why it eventually got pushed through. Speaking of ancient Rome, here's an aqueduct arcade. Okay, the aqueduct builders of ancient Rome were the greatest in history. In many ways, people like Jervis and Douglas were looking directly to the ancient Romans for inspiration because there were very few precedents between the aqueducts of ancient Rome and the Old Croton Aqueduct. There were a few in Europe and London, and there was one in Portugal, but they weren't nearly as long or nearly as extensive. And so for New Yorkers to build this aqueduct was a conceit, sort of a neoclassical conceit in many ways. And so the Highbridge, very, very self-consciously, is made to look like an ancient Roman aqueduct arcade, this sort of thing. This is outside of one of my favorite cities in the Roman Empire, Split in Croatia. And so it's just a series of round arches. It's an arcade, technically speaking. So when Allen, because the plan initially was Douglas's, right? This was Douglas the dreamer, right? Douglas the theoretician, Douglas the philosopher. Of course, he's going to come up with the Highbridge. When Douglas gets fired and replaced with Jervis, Jervis and Allen decide they're not going to build the Highbridge. They're going to build something they called the Low Bridge, and it looked like this. The Low Bridge was infinitely uglier and less impressive than the Highbridge. It basically consisted of an unbroken dam, just a wall on the Bronx half of the Harlem River, and then a single sort of 50-foot high arch on the Manhattan side. And this was going to conduct the entire river, this one arch. It was about half the price. Okay, Allen was very happy with the Low Bridge. Everybody was very happy with the Low Bridge. Unfortunately for Allen and Jervis, the people of New York got wind of this and were not happy at all. There are letters to the editor by the thousands in every newspaper. Also, this fellow stepped in. His name was Louis G. Morris, or Louis Gouverneur Morris. The Morrises were some of the most powerful people in the history of New York City. We don't remember them. We remember Hamilton, we remember Rockefeller, we remember Astor, or whatever. We don't necessarily remember Morris, but these people were true blue bloods. They had some of the deepest roots in the city. They were some of the wealthiest people and the most influential. They owned a massive estate in what is now the South Bronx called Morrisania. Morrisania was huge, hundreds and hundreds of acres, and it straddled along its eastern border almost the entirety of the Harlem River. The Morrises wanted the Highbridge. They wanted it really bad because they were going to be the first to benefit from commerce and boat traffic on the Harlem River. And so the Morrises, incidentally, had been very deeply involved in the development of the street grid. This guy's great uncle, Louis Gouverneur Morris, who incidentally wrote the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Okay, Louis Gouverneur Morris had been involved in developing the street grid in the first part. A guy like this would have considered it sort of his birthright, to make decisions about how the city should be developed. And so he steps in. And he very quickly, gets together a memorial to the state. And he has basically every landowner in the Bronx sign on to it. And they succeed eventually. Where am I? Sorry. They succeed eventually in getting the Highbridge built. A big part of Morris's argument is not just that a Highbridge is going to facilitate commerce, a Highbridge is going to facilitate development, but also that he needs the Highbridge because he's going to dig a canal that runs continuously from the East River all the way to the Hudson River. Okay, we have that now. It's called looks like this. Okay, this is it going through Spuyten Duyvil. It's an enormous man-made canal. It sounded very good on paper, but a lot of people laughed at Morris when he said he was going to do this, and for good reason. The Harlem River at the time looked like this. Okay, it did not run continuously to the Hudson River. In fact, there were two separate waterways, the Spuyten Duyvil Creek and the Harlem River, and the two of them were connected by a lot of mud flats, basically. So the idea of going continuously from the East River to the Hudson was a little far-fetched in the 1830s. It made sense in the 1890s when they had the technology, but at the time, Morris's argument was a little far-fetched. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. He was too powerful, and he was a Whig. The Whigs, we already had a two-party system at the time. There were the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs were in power, and Morris was a Whig. And number three, he had the people of New York on his side. And so the Highbridge came into being. Okay, so anyways, that's more or less the talk. And I hope you all had a good time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're going to take some questions, and I'm going to come around with the microphone so people online can hear us.
Yes, Gil. Oh, I'm sorry, she's coming with the mic.
All right, check. There we go.
Sorry, Sarah.
Thank you. Hello. Has there been any underwater film taken of the old dam and all the structures that were obliterated by the reservoir? Has anybody ever gone down there?
Yes, they have. But it's been a long time, and I haven't seen the photographs.
Yeah.
It wasn't done in an organized way or in a particularly, quote-unquote, scientific way.
Right.
And there's currently a new effort afoot to do that.
Great. I also have some currency
Good.
calculations. You said $4,000 an acre in 1837
Yeah, for John Singh.
would be $130,780 today.
Okay.
The
Doesn't sound like much in Westchester.
No, well, I don't know. This might not sound like much either. The Highbridge, $1 million in, let's say, 1837.
Yeah.
$32,700,000 today, supposedly.
Again, for a major public works project, New York City doesn't sound like much, but it was, yeah. Hi, Jean.
Great presentation, thank you. Can you hear me? So I have a question about Lyndhurst.
Yeah.
And we were walking around there the other day and totally confused about when that property was transferred, under what circumstances, so I'm sure you know.
Actually, I don't. I don't know about the colonial history of Lyndhurst. I'm not sure.
But during the aqueduct.
During the period of the aqueduct, I think it might have belonged to. No,
I think
Gould.
before Gould. Yeah.
It wasn't born yet. I don't.
Yeah.
So it would have been like was that? Possibly. Yeah, I was going to say Hamilton. Alexander's son, who lived just north of there, but or just south of there, but I'm not sure.
I was just wondering, though, whether it seems kind of amazing that the aqueduct was allowed to cross that beautiful estate.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what kind of concessions they got, or
Yes.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rich people did, get more concessions than others, but the route was pretty fixed, and so a number of people, the Beekmans, the Dykmans, the lots of Van Cortlands, lots of blue bloods, got their property taken. I think mostly because the line was fixed. However, they were given more concessions than other people, and so perhaps the fact that it's completely subterranean during that stretch is significant. They may have lowered it, which they could do.
So, in response to your interest in, viewing the structures that were flooded by the construction of the dam, I can remember as a youngster, and I must have been around 1960 or maybe even a little earlier than that, but we had a tremendous drought in New York at the time, and the reservoirs were greatly depleted, and you actually could see
Yeah.
the farms and the houses that were in the reservoirs. So if you're really interested, you could go back and research newspapers from that time, and you would see some of that.
Yeah, it's pretty low.
I read the other day that the reservoirs normally are 3/4 full this time of year, and they're 2/3, so we're nowhere near that. But my question to you, Keith, is so the aqueduct was completed in the mid 1840s, correct?
Right. Early 1840s,
Early 1840s.
Yeah.
And when was the Erie Canal completed?
1825.
So this must have been a huge boost to New York City in terms of commerce, right? Because now they could actually support a much larger population.
Oh, it was water.
Yeah.
Water. The population tripled in like 30 years.
But the opening of the Erie Canal must have been a big boost to New York City also.
Economically, sure.
Yeah.
But it's nothing compared to, clean water. It's Oh, the ventilators. Oh, okay. Yeah. I promised. So every mile on the aqueduct, and all the FOCA people know this all too well, there's a ventilator, and the purpose of the ventilators, from what I understand, I'm not an engineer. An engineer told me that they're basically just to release air, or to aerate the water, and also to release pressure, because you can get these waves within the conduit and create a lot of pressure. And so they need outlets periodically. So, yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Mom.
Really, I understand that the Irish were, not that attractive in their presentation while they were building. But did they ever get credit for doing all that work? I mean, my God.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to bring in, but I didn't have time, is that, the vast majority of people in Westchester disapproved of the Irish, but they had their advocates. In fact, there were a number of people that spoke out passionately in defense of the Irish. And, many Irish settled in Westchester because of their work. On the aqueduct, the first Roman Catholic church in Westchester was a result of aqueduct workers needing a place to worship. So, yes, they had their advocates, and they did get credit. Many people in the city understood full well that without the Irish, there was no aqueduct.
Next.
My question is, how was the water delivered to the houses, and do you know how much they would pay? Was it like a meter or something?
You mean if a house, if they had to destroy a house or something like that?
No. When the water comes to your house,
Yeah.
Did they have a faucet? How did they get it delivered, and how much would they pay the city to get water delivered to the house?
Right. It was a slow process. Most houses, no houses in Manhattan had indoor plumbing, so they had to figure out how to install indoor plumbing. What did it need? They had to invent all the fixtures. It was a long process. So for a long time, unless you were very rich, you didn't have water directly into your house. You had to go to a pump at an intersection, especially if you're poor, because there was a hookup fee.
I actually have a related question.
Yeah.
Which is, did they install any sewer systems at the same time that they were bringing fresh water into the city, or was that later?
Yes, no, they did. Absolutely. In fact, I think the sewer system slightly, especially in the newer parts of the city, like above the wall, the sewer systems predate the aqueduct slightly.
So water mains are always breaking in New York City and everywhere.
Yeah.
How is it that this thing isn't bursting all along the 40-mile route?
It's amazing. It's just incredibly well built.
There's no cars driving on it.
What's that?
There's no cars driving in it, and
There's no
building
car.
built on
It's.
it.
I mean, I guess it's not doesn't take the beating, that the water mains in Manhattan are taking. But there's 3 miles worth of conduit running under Manhattan. It's never collapsed in almost 200 years. It's just a testament to how well built it is. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
Keith, you've described like a lot of the decisions being made for cost reasons and engineering reasons and sometimes political reasons, pressure. In your research, did you ever see anything about corruption or anything like that intruding into the process?
Yes. Absolutely.
How so?
It was. I think, the corruption actually was on the part of landowners. Landowners were a bunch of them, especially a guy called Livingston, Dobbs Ferry. Many of the villages in Westchester began because landowners realized that the aqueduct was coming through, and so they decided to develop a village so that their land would be worth 10 times what it would be worth as a farm. If that's corruption, I'm not sure. But many people did that. In Hastings, Dobbs Ferry, they decided to build it's a quarry. It's not a farm. It's or whatever. So there was lots of that. Yeah. And I'm sure plenty of city officials were on the take.
Keith,
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Keith. I'm kind of interested in the logistics of building the aqueduct. I mean, there are thousands of bricks per linear foot in the aqueduct, and all the stones that support it. So it's got a massive foundation. And have you got any information about where the bricks were manufactured or where the quarries were for the stone, and I imagine it was by ox cart. Have you got any logistical information about that?
Yes. So they had a number. All right, there it is. They had a number of quarries along the aqueduct, and it's easy to identify a quarry that was made by aqueduct workers. They're very distinctive. They usually 10 feet deep. They have this sort of squared off. There's one on Yonkers Avenue, and there's one in Hastings as well, and it's actually indicated on a map. This one may have pre-existed the aqueduct, but there was plenty of gneiss, that Fordham gneiss, which is everything in New York is made out of. There are large outcroppings all along the route, and they made use of a lot of that. So most of it was quarried on site. The bricks, they were brickyards by the early 19th century. There were brickyards all over the Hudson Valley. Hudson Valley is just loaded with clay. There's brickyards everywhere. Yeah, Fred.
Keith, wonderful work. Were the Irish speaking Irish?
Yes.
So they were not speaking English. So they were truly foreign at that point.
Yeah.
And,
most of them were from Sligo, which is really the boonies in Ireland. So these were not Dubliners, coming over.
And one point, I don't think dynamite had been invented yet.
Oh, really?
And they were blasting with black powder, and there were very few places where they blasted because black powder was so perilous to use. So those sites, and I think there are maybe only 4
Yeah.
on the trail,
Right.
were black powder.
I wonder how that worked.
But the big question,
Yeah.
the question, not the comments, I learned recently that the Broadway was diverted in Tarrytown. In
Yeah.
fact, the actual Andre capture
Yeah.
occurred on where the aqueduct is today. And what diversions of Broadway occurred, including that one in Tarrytown?
That's the only one that I know of.
Wow.
That's the only one. It's extraordinary to me because Broadway and the aqueduct are basically parallel. I mean, they intersect at many, many points, but the one in Tarrytown is the only diversion of Broadway. I think it would have been, but there are times when the aqueduct runs directly under Broadway, but it's Broadway as it is now. So I'm sure there are others, but that's the only one I know for sure. I think they were at great, great pains not to disrupt Broadway. There were not a lot of roads in Westchester in 1838. I mean, if you closed Broadway down for 6 months, I mean, you'd cripple Westchester. And so that's the only one that I know of. There's probably more, though. Yeah.
I've also wondered about this. Are we getting our water from,
Yes.
and all up and down, was Westchester getting its water from the aqueduct?
The Old Croton Aqueduct hasn't been in use since like 1955.
Right.
So it is no longer active. It's dry along the whole length of it. But the new Croton Aqueduct is still active, along with 2 much larger, more sophisticated aqueducts in Ulster County. One's called the Catskill Aqueduct, one's called the Delaware Aqueduct. And together with the new Croton Aqueduct, they deliver something like 1.5 billion gallons a day to New York City, and Westchester gets its water from the same system. So it's mostly coming from Ulster County, and to a lesser degree from the new Croton Aqueduct. Yes?
I understood that portions of the aqueduct go uphill, that water is under pressure.
Yeah. I neglected to mention when we were talking about the low bridge that something called an inverted siphon is employed in this case. It's actually an ancient Roman device, but you can send the conduit into a valley and have it travel up the other side of the valley by using something called an inverted siphon. It's an iron pipe that's actually relatively narrow. And so when the water enters it, it's very pressurized, and it causes it to shoot up the other side of the valley. Yeah?
Can you go back to the slide that shows the river and the canal? And I'd like to just
Oh, sure.
And look at Marble Hill.
Yeah. Yeah. All of this is what's called Marble Hill. And now what am I saying? A bunch of New Yorkers, you know very well what Marble Hill is. You may not know that Marble Hill considers itself part of Manhattan, even though it sits north of this canal that we've created, this Harlem River Canal. Marble Hill, the reason it thinks it's part of Manhattan is because it was part of Manhattan. Originally, the Harlem River ran up and over it, and the Spite and Dival Creek ran down the other side of it.
Try putting the cursor on the Google Earth.
Oh, right. So Marble Hill is right here.
And you could see almost where the river used to be.
Yep, you can see it very clearly. And the King's Bridge, if you've ever heard of the King's Bridge, okay, this was a colonial, it was the first connection between New York City and Westchester, was located right here because it's the shallowest place. And the toll bridge. Yeah, the Phillipses made, the same people who, this place could not be built without the King's Bridge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Charlie.
So I was just going to mention that in Ossining, there is a 3-way valve that allows the water to be dumped into the Hudson River.
Yeah.
So that they could service the pipe down below.
Yeah. The weirs are another like really cool feature I mean, they're right up there with the ventilators. You know, they're big square stone buildings. They're usually covered with graffiti. They have been, they have looked like that since the 70s, especially in Yonkers. Okay, they are the purpose of those places is to divert the water, as you said, the water coming down. Conduit is diverted, and they're always right beside streams, and there's a channel so that the water can go into the stream and they can service the conduit down.
So wasn't the eminent domain result an argument legally? Didn't that change the way it affected other places in the country? The whole idea of eminent domain?
Oh, yes.
That you could take over land to service another
I
area?
mean, you know, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a lawyer either, but I know that many legal precedents were set by, you know, conflicts between, you know, landowners and the city regarding eminent domain, regarding the rights of the city. Most of them focus on the fact that the city ought not have the power to take land. Technically, the state should be the entity that has the power to take land, and the way the OCA worked is that the state basically imbued the city with the power to take land, and many people rightly objected to that. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
You'll go next.
Okay, so a question that maybe is slightly off topic.
Oh.
In New York City, when the aqueduct was dug down through what would be Central Park,
Yeah.
you know, there was Seneca Village
Yeah.
there that was occupied by the Irish as well as African Americans.
Yeah.
So they were evicted by eminent domain to build the park.
Yeah.
And I always wonder, though, because the reservoir was right there, whether those people were involved in building the aqueduct. Do you know any of that history?
You mean like the residents of Seneca Village?
Yeah.
I'm sure. Son of
Yeah.
they were poor Irish.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, there were no black employees of the New York Corporation of the City of New York. I don't know why that is, and I've looked into it actually pretty extensively. I don't understand it. There must have been racism involved. The Irish were also extremely aggressive about keeping other groups out of there, and we're not just talking about black. Anybody, Germans, you know, they would run you right out. They were, you know, violent. Yeah.
Are there any plans to restore the weir at Untermeyer?
Are there any? Sorry.
Plans to restore the weir at Untermeyer?
I don't know. It would be great. That would be great. There's a weir just below Untermeyer Park on the aqueduct. It has actually the best graffiti on the whole aqueduct. I mean, these guys were like amazing artists. But that has been something that, you know, I would love it if they did that. You know, because right at the moment, the only weir that you can access legally is in Ossining. You know, that's where I got all those pictures. But yeah, it would be great to have another weir open to the public, and that would be a great choice. I don't know if they're doing it or not. Hi, how you doing?
Good. So when did Westchester begin to receive water from the aqueduct, considering they gave up all their land
Yeah,
to have it built?
I don't know. I don't know when that started. Does anybody know?
It was gradual. Most of the municipalities had local sources.
Okay.
So, for example, in Yonkers, when I was growing up here, water was being taken out of either the Sawmill River or Grassy Spring Reservoir.
Yeah.
But both of those became polluted sometime in the 60s and 70s. And I think the same is true as you go up in many of the places. For example, in Irvington, you have the Irvington Reservoir. In Tarrytown, you have their reservoir, and so on.
Yeah.
But gradually, most municipalities, as far as I know, buy their water from New York City.
Yeah. It's one of the ironies. It's one of the ironies of the aqueduct, and one of the reasons that so many of the eminent domain people had a point that landowners couldn't access any of that water. You sold your land, they built the conduit through your land, and none of that water was yours. Yes, sir.
One thing about municipalities getting their water, Ossining, I believe, gets their water from the aqueduct.
Still.
But there's a 6-foot plug
Yeah.
at that water treatment facility, Ossining's water treatment facility that's right,
Right.
on the trail, and they get the top 2 miles or so of the aqueduct are still functioning.
So they get it from the Croton River.
They get it from the New Croton Reservoir by way of the Old Croton Aqueduct. I think, yeah, I don't know the name, but yeah, so there's a 6-foot plug in the aqueduct, and it's still
Great.
it's still, that little top piece is still functioning.
I had heard that, and then I tried to verify it, and I couldn't.
This was a Brian Goodman fact.
Oh,
If
okay.
any of you
Yeah,
know
yeah.
him. So it could be, it could be debatable. The other, and one more thing, the aqueduct was, not the aqueduct, the New Croton Reservoir was drained in 1957.
Huh.
There was grout issues, and they regrouted the dam, so they drained it, and the Old Croton Dam functioned again.
Wow.
And the actual valves, gearing still worked.
Wow.
In 1957.
Wow. Thank you.
Any
Anybody
other
else?
questions?
Okay. Well, thank you so much.